Okay, so in this debate, I'm going to be arguing that the way that Jesus is buried in the Gospels is the least likely possibility out of all the possible things that could have happened to his body. Him being buried in the most expensive imaginable way is the least likely option. If we consider all of the different possible things that could have happened to his body after he was dead, he could have been left on the cross for vultures and wild dogs. That's option one. We know that that the Romans did this a lot. Martin Hengel states in Crucifixion in the Ancient World, page 87 and 88, he says, crucifixion was aggravated further by the fact that quite often its victims were never buried. It was a stereotyped picture that the crucified victim served as food for wild beasts and birds of prey. In this way, his humiliation was made complete. What it meant for a man in antiquity to be refused burial and the dishonor which went with it can hardly be appreciated by modern man. This is option one. We know that this happened. We have plenty of ancient texts talking about this, that this was done to crucified individuals. But it's also possible that the Jews would have pitched enough of a fit about Deuteronomy 21 being violated that maybe the Romans allowed bodies to be taken down and buried. If that was the case, option two, thrown into a mass grave with other dead bodies. So, one, Jesus' body was left on the cross for vultures and dogs. Two, he was thrown into a mass grave with the other guys who were crucified right next to him. Three, he could have just been buried. He could have had his own individual grave in the ground, and maybe it was marked, maybe it wasn't. But it wasn't in a wealthy tomb. So the burial in the sepulcher of Joseph of Arimathea, option four, is the least likely of those options. And the reason it's the least likely is because of what Jesus was convicted of, which was sedition against the Roman Empire, the worst crime you could be convicted of. I find it very hard to believe that the Romans would allow a convicted seditionist to be given the most honorable and most expensive burial imaginable. Right under having your own mausoleum built. So that's my first argument. My second argument is, and actually Caleb addressed this in his presentation, but my second argument is that Christians would have remembered the location of the sepulcher over the years, and that they did not. Now, Caleb made an interesting argument. I didn't expect him to say that he thinks that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the actual burial location of Jesus. I think he said it was over 50% in his estimation. I have a quote here from James D. Tabor, an archaeologist, in his book, The Jesus Dynasty, page 225 through 226. He says, the authenticity of either site is problematic. The Protestant site and the Catholic site. The tomb at the Protestant site has been dated to the Iron Age, 5th century BC, which is much too early to fit the description of a newly hewn tomb. The Catholic site, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, is based upon traditions from the 4th century, a full 300 years after Jesus' crucifixion. It is just yards from the ancient northern city wall, near a deep rock quarry, an unlikely area for new tombs and gardens. Its authenticity was based on relics that Empress Helena claimed to find, such as the true cross of Jesus buried nearby, bolstered by visions and reported miracles. The tomb that Helena chose is very likely that of John Hyrcanus, the 2nd century BC Maccabean ruler. It was mentioned a number of times by Josephus precisely in that location. This site simply does not fit the biblical or historical record. So this is from James D. Tabor in the Jesus Dynasty. And I think that that kind of settles it in my mind as being under 50% likely the tomb of Jesus. There's no ancient sources that talk about Christians visiting the site or venerating it before the 4th century. So yeah, I really don't think that Caleb's assessment of the evidence is very very accurate. Okay, my third argument.
5 minutes left.
My third argument is that, In Caleb's presentation, he showed pictures in Christian art, of Jesus being taken off the cross. One thing that you also find a lot in Christian art is depictions of Jesus' crucifixion being surrounded by crowds of people all watching it. This is extremely inaccurate, and the reason it's inaccurate is because crucifixion was not an event that one would go to watch, like a beheading or burning or something like that. Crucifixions took a long time. You didn't just die. You languished on the cross for hours and usually days. So I find it extremely unlikely that the disciples of Jesus or the family of Jesus were just hanging out for 6 hours waiting for him to die, and they didn't even know that he would die after 6 hours. They would have expected him to last for days. So are they gonna stay there for days waiting for him to die? I find that to be extremely unlikely. So and there's also a text from the Mishnah that states that if you have a relative or loved one who's crucified, you should get out of the city. You shouldn't stay there because of the shame of the situation. It's Semachat 2:13. It says, if one's husband, wife, father, or mother has been crucified in his city, one should not continue to reside there unless it is a city as big as Antioch. Even then, one should not reside in the same side of the city, but in another part. Until when is one so forbidden? Until the flesh is completely decomposed and the identity unrecognizable from the bones. So I find it very unlikely that Jesus' disciples or his family were there when he did eventually die. They wouldn't have just waited around for hours and days. And so if they weren't around, who was around? Well, the Romans who were guarding him, obviously. And what would the Romans have done with his body after he did die? They would have thrown it into a criminal's grave. They would not have buried it in an expensive tomb. All right, so, and this is, I have a fourth point. This isn't really an argument, but it's just something to take note of. A nice burial in a wealthy tomb is exactly the kind of thing that Christians would have made up for their religious figure that they worship as a god. Of course, they don't want him to have a dishonorable burial, being eaten by vultures or dogs, or thrown into a common grave. They would want to imagine that he was given this expensive and extremely honorable burial.
2 minutes.
Gotcha. By this Jewish Sanhedrin member. So, in my remaining time, I'm just going to go through some of the stuff that Caleb mentioned. So, okay, in 1 Corinthians 15, he mentions, Paul says in the early creed that, Jesus was buried after he died. Of course, this doesn't imply burial in a tomb. It could also just be burial in the ground. And the point Paul was making when he said that Jesus was buried, the point was to make it clear that he was really dead. He didn't survive the crucifixion. So it wasn't about his burial. It was about his death. That was the whole point. Okay, so let's see here. The empty tomb tradition being primitive, predating Mark, doesn't mean that it was real. It could be an earlier tradition that was still made up. Women discovering the tomb, I really didn't expect Caleb to make this argument, because I find this to be probably the weakest argument for the empty tomb. There are so many reasons why a gospel writer would have imagined women discovering the tomb. It goes with the first shall be last and the last shall be first motif. Women were the ones who prepared the body with spices. It was considered a women's job. So there's so many reasons why the gospel writers would have had women discover the tomb. It doesn't mean that it was true. All right.